The creation versus evolution argument has been raging since the founding of paleontology. I'm sure it will continue for many years to come. Both sides seem more interested in one-upping each other than coming to a reasonable resolution, at least based on the arguments I see on the various forums. But that doesn't stop them from using the other's research to bring the argument to their side. Quite recently, a video about a scientist who supposedly found evidence to disprove evolution has cropped up on my feed, as well as on one of the forums, where denouncers and the faithful clash the most. When I say clash, I mean just whack heads against each other, whilst not providing much to the argument at all, if you're lucky. One of these, which is Answers for Atheists, naturally had a lot of response to it. But as a frequent commenter on that forum, I felt I should put my more precise input into this and cover it in a video. So, here we are. I've got my phone here. I'm not sure whether I'll do a duet or more likely I think I might just do a side piece, see what happens. But before I delve into this, I'm going to put forward my original position on the topic and maybe a prediction, because I know some people on this site are going to give me merry hell for not looking at it objectively or even scientifically, as one person genuinely requested me to do. Furthermore, they are not afraid to jump in and make those assumptions in public without asking the right questions, which is ironic for people trying to promote reason. So, my position is, I'm a Christian, and I think the Bible is fairly covered. It has the creation story pretty much pinned down compared to the scientific reference. And I don't think that science and religion should be at odds on each other on this position at all. I'll leave links to the videos that will explain more about it, since I'm not one to repeat myself if it were possible, and I started this channel to prevent that from happening in the first place. In short, I see no reason to think evolution is wrong or that it disproves Genesis 1. Having seen similar articles on this very topic, I think this video is going to fall into many of the traps that most others do, including the giraffe's neck, the dolphin issue, irreducible complexity, statistical improbability with time and mutations, well-preserved dinosaur specimens, and potentially the gaps in the fossil record. These are classic arguments that constantly fail because people think of them in the wrong direction, similar to how some atheists look at religion. So, with those caveats out of the way, let's see what this video has to offer with this argument.
Well, we can take Darwin's words himself to answer that question. Darwin himself said that his ideas on evolution are entirely based and totally depends on Elias' geological speculations, which have since been disproved by cutting-edge sedimentology. In a letter, with regards to whether it's true science or not, his theory, in a letter to Asa Gray, he wrote, quote, "I am quite conscious that my speculations run beyond the bounds of true science. It is a mere rag of an hypothesis with as many flaws and holes as sound parts." Close quotes.
Using that, you could potentially make an argument, but I'm not sure that quoting Darwin's doubts is anything to show that his theory means nothing. If anything, it just shows he's following true scientific doctrine and not saying this is absolute fact and just ploughing on with it. If anything, he's being more open-minded than most people about religion.
At least he's honest.
Now, the speculative nature of evolution, so obviously there's been about 150 to 200 years of time since Darwin published The Origins of the Species. And so we can also hear what others have had to say. And the fact of the matter is that there are, despite the very prevalent and dogmatic support that theory of evolution commands today amongst the scientific community, there are a leading and growing number of honest scientists that following 150 years of fruitless searches for evidence that would support the theory has spoken about the Darwin's theory. We have Dr. Ernst Chain, Nobel Prize-winning biochemistry, who helped develop penicillin in 1972. He called the theory of evolution, quote, a very feeble attempt to understand the development of life, close quote. In another...
I don't know, I think it's a fairly honest representation, and if you look at Genesis, it seems to back it up quite nicely.
Statement he made, he said, quote, I would rather believe in fairies than in such wild speculation as Darwinian evolution, close quote. We have Louise Bonoret, professor of geology at the University of Strasbourg, say, quote, evolutionism is a fairy tale for grown-ups. This theory has helped nothing in the progress of science. It is useless, close quote. And we have Albert Fleischmann, German professor of geology, say, quote, the Darwinian theory of descent has not a single fact to confirm it in the realm of nature. It is not the result of scientific research, but purely the product of imagination, close quote.
I'm not sure about that one. Just because some people disbelieve it doesn't mean anything. I mean, a mate of mine, he doesn't believe in macroevolution, and interestingly enough, he studies microbiology and how to influence microbes into producing light.
Obviously, we don't want to appeal to authority in our discussion, but I think it's important to give a perspective on the words that Darwin himself used, but also on the words of other scientists, eminent scientists,
Sure.
that have taken a dispassionate view on the topic.
And I think this is something that's so crucial to cover because basically, I mean, it's quite shocking to be honest, because in most schools today, in this country, and even in, I mean, we have a brother here from India who was saying that in his education, in his biology textbooks, evolution was all over, was everywhere. So basically it's been
proclaimed as a fact.
It's proclaimed as a fact. And
well, not necessarily. He mentions it as a theory, and same with anything else. I think it's just good to have all bases covered in education, including religious and scientific.
The thing that's quite shocking is that, I mean, as these scientists have just said, there's not a single fact which backs it up. So obviously there's something quite strange going on behind the scenes here. Anyway, so the question I have for you now is regarding Darwin's theory, what are the biggest problems that you see in his theory?
Here we go.
There are so many problems. I will highlight just a few, but you know, we could have lots of talks about this. The whole thing is, as intimated by some of the earlier quotes, is full of flaws. But the fundamental issues with it are, I'll just list them quickly. First of all, evolution is not observed and is not happening today.
Not observed and not happening today. Microevolution, yes, and technically some form of macroevolution, or at least semi-macroevolution, if you consider how we bred dogs to be completely different. I mean, yes, a German Shepherd looks remarkably like a wolf, but if you bear in mind, a pug looks nothing like a German Shepherd. You got something that is drastically different.
It has not been observed in the past. It presupposes but cannot account for the origin of life. I'm talking primarily of biological evolution here.
Presupposes biology and life. Not a creation of life. That is true. It is presupposing that life evolved or started beforehand, and that's something I think that science is struggling to find, an origin for life. The origin of species is explained by evolution, but not the origin of life.
It violates an important physical law, the second law of thermodynamics.
Law of thermodynamics. Again, that's life itself rather than evolution, so you got a point, but it's still missing it.
Natural selection and mutation has been shown conclusively not to work. It failed.
Reproduction and mutation. Well, it does work within certain limits. I'm interested to see how he goes with that. As I said, mutation, that was bound to crop up, so ding.
To account for the irreducible complexity that we observe in biological systems.
Irreducible complexity, that's the second strike.
It fails to account for the origin of specified information in the biological systems, primarily the genetic code.
I'll allow for that one because, quite frankly, life itself started pretty complex, apparently.
And it fails because it violates many first principles in philosophy, which actually renders the very concept of evolution metaphysically impossible and hence irrational. That's just a summary of the problems, but it's
more extensive. Yeah.
more extensive.
I'd just like to ask a quick, because I mean, obviously, you're speaking to someone here who's very, very bad at science. I mean, yes. So biology was probably my worst subject. So could you please expand on some of the things you said? Because to a lot of it, it's like you're speaking a different language.
Yes, I mean, the purpose of these points that I'm making is really to encourage people to do their own research and to be with an open mind. It's all.
And that's a kick in the face of people that say that religion is all about not thinking. He's encouraging people to do their own research, and that's something I do constantly in my videos.
Available, it's all out there. It's not spoken about in textbooks, but with an open mind and some research, all these can be found. And I think it's important for people to also form their own opinion about this.
Sure.
But I will just go through some of these points in a bit more detail. So the first point was that Darwinian evolution is not observed and is not happening today. So whenever experiments have been tried to reproduce or simulate the evolutionary process in the laboratory, they've always failed to produce any new species. I give a quick example. E. coli is a form of bacterium, very, very simple organism that reproduces every 20 minutes. Because they reproduce every 20 minutes, they have analyzed it over a period of decades now. So you can recreate in the lab, you can speed up evolution, which is, according to the evolutionary theory, can take over hundreds of millions of years, and kind of recreate it by looking at these organisms that reproduce very quickly, generation after generation. You can recreate it in the lab. And the bottom line is that notwithstanding decades of these small bacteria called Escherichia coli reproducing under very favorable conditions every 20 minutes, lots of generation, recreating effectively the process of evolution, they still are bacteria. They haven't become sponges and cats or frogs and so on. They've done.
That is unfortunately not the point of it. Let's see, child populations, got the research up here. Let's see, child populations, 75,000 generations, well-controlled situation. Let me see what it says. I probably won't be able to scroll for it, but if you bear in mind what were the criteria, I'm pretty sure it wasn't to prove that it was able to grow into fish, frogs, that sort of thing. No. What were the pressures? It's in favourable conditions, and therefore, if anything, it shows that Earth is the best planet for life. If anything, it sort of proves that Neil deGrasse Tyson didn't understand evolution in terms of life, in terms of the Earth being perfect. It's not perfect. It forces life to change. It's perfect for evolution, not necessarily for life.
And a lot of work has been done by a scientist called Lenski on this topic. Fruit flies, they've been irradiated with UV light to try and get mutations to change their form, and all that happens is that they just get deformed and die. They do not evolve.
The fruit fly, I've heard of that experiment, and whilst it proves that, trying to alter genetics by brute forcing it, that doesn't work. It's literally like trying to alter a house by ripping out a supporting wall. It's just going to come down your head. That's sort of the point. Evolution isn't a brute force thing, it's a gradual thing. It's like a game of Chinese whispers. Things just subtly change. It alters until eventually it's out of sight, out of mind, and eventually becomes like the ship of Theseus. Just parts being replaced until eventually it's a completely different thing.
In the IT world. I mean, so the idea was if any scientific theory, empirical scientific theory, in the modern sense of the word, should be able to be recreated through simulation. For example, in the cosmological field or the physical sciences, this is a very common thing, but it has never been able to be successfully recreated through simulations in computer science and IT. And the only way to make it work is if you introduce ad hoc interventions, meaning that you have to kind of fix the parameters in order to get the answer that you want. But that is not how evolution, in terms of the theory of evolution, is meant to work, which is meant to be a blind process with.
I suppose so, but that's assuming a perfect world where life has no competition, has nothing to force it to change. That's why predator-prey reactions pretty much precipitated a mass evolutionary change over the years and probably resulted in the Great Cambrian explosion. But also, life itself had trouble with the environment, such as climate change, meteor strikes, and stuff like that. So, given favorable conditions, life will pretty much stay as it is, because that works. Given unfavorable conditions, it will change to aim towards something that happens to work. Well, not necessarily aim, but certainly have a block in which it happens to work. Criteria, if you will.
No guiding force, and
Sure.
no intervention. So it's not happening today. It has not been observed and is not happening in the past. And that's the second point I was making. And here we have to look at the fossil record. In The Origin of Species, Darwin himself made these comments, which are very significant. He wrote, quote, "As by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth?" Close quote. He himself.
That's the third strike. That is, what was it? Gaps in the fossil record. So, yeah. Those gaps have been filled now, or at least most of them have. And as many scientists rightly say, if there is a gap, it'll eventually be filled by something. We have a fairly, not a conclusive catalogue of transitional forms, but certainly enough to fill in most of the gaps.
Describe the lack of transitional fossils as, quote, "the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory," close quote. Now, at the time, people were saying, oh, we haven't looked around enough. We will find these fossils. Okay, so we wind the clock forward 100 years of hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to try and support and buttress the theory of evolution. And atheist paleontologist Niles Ehrlich, very famous paleontologist, in the 1970s acknowledged that despite massive efforts, nothing has changed. Quote, "It is a simple, ineluctable truth that virtually all members of a biota," which basically means a species or a category of beings, of living beings, remain basically stable with minor fluctuations during their duration, meaning that there is no new forms that can be observed. The reality is that no meaningful fossils of the intermediate forms that are required by Darwinian evolution has been found to date, despite the existence of billions of fossils. Such a large number, incidentally, argues for a catastrophic event like the global flood. But the fact.
And that's debatable, really, because, well, firstly, the sea creatures of the Cambrian and later Cambrian periods and later Jurassic and Mesozoic eras would have been more likely to survive the rise in sea levels that would have resulted from the flood. I'm very aware. Well, someone even showed a so-called fossil of a plesiosaur that wasn't even a plesiosaur; it was actually a shark. Furthermore, there's once more gaps in the fossil record that are being filled gradually, and just because some people don't like it doesn't mean anything. Some total fossil record pretty much breaks the nitrogen and carbon cycles. You need those to go on. Fossils require very particular circumstances in order to develop, in order to be preserved.
That these transitional forms, as you evolved over time from the simplest organism all the way through ultimately to man, you would expect a lot of intermediate forms.
Sure, yeah.
But they just don't exist. They haven't been found. As evolutionary atheist biologist Jeffrey H. Schwartz admitted, quote, instead of filling the gaps in the fossil record with so-called missing links, most paleontologists found themselves facing a situation in which there were only gaps in the fossil record with no evidence of transformational intermediates between documented fossil species, close quotes. These are signs.
Those gaps have been filled, though. I don't have the evidence to back it up. There's plenty online. Give yourself the chance to find it. I'm pretty sure any evolutionist will point you in the right direction. That's why you need to speak to people in those fields. That's why atheists also need to talk to biblical scholars who understand the Bible just as well, if not more.
Themselves saying this. What we see instead is the same living forms persisting over supposedly hundreds of millions of years of supposed evolution. There are fossils of squids that are supposed to be hundreds of millions of years old that look indistinguishable from the squids of today. Bugs.
Well, considering that squid are soft creatures today, we can't tell what they would have been like. And I've even heard of squid having shells back in the day. Now it's just their beak that's preserved, if we're lucky.
Stay bugs, as David Belinsky famously said.
Bugs have been a workable form for millions of years. Just because a form happens to work doesn't mean it's stale, and doesn't mean others don't happen to work. Plus, you have to look at the genome to actually see that some forms of insect actually died out long before others did, and therefore others filled their place and happen to look very similar. That's convergent evolution.
There's no evidence in the past that evolution has happened. Evolution presupposes but cannot account for the origin of life. Scientists have never been able to generate even the very basic constituents of life from simple chemicals, despite decades of research and hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. For example, there's no assembly of amino acids, which are the constituent blocks of proteins, into proteins under abiotic conditions. And the work of James Tour, who's one of the most credentialed origin of life scientists in the world, with 800 research publications, over 130 granted patents, and over 100 pending patents, he basically indicates that there are unsurmountable technical difficulties of generating even the simplest of biological molecules, let alone any kind of simple organism. Experimentally, it's impossible.
And that's my sticking point with evolution. I accept evolution as a process when life came about and actually was able to develop, but there is a wall at which evolution butts up against. Beyond a certain point in the past, life needs to be generated. It doesn't spontaneously come from nothing. And science has not yet been able to prove otherwise.
This primordial soup model that you often see in many of the biological textbooks is just a fairy tale. It's a fable. Mm-hmm. It violates the second law of thermodynamics. This is a physical law that basically says that everything tends from an ordered state to a disordered state.
Not quite. You're talking about entropy. That very much is the least likely state to the most likely state, which does tend to be chaotic, to be fair. However, that again is more of a issue with life developing in the first place, not evolution. The moment life itself is developed, evolution takes over, and that's it. So that's really an issue with his second point, rather than evolution as a whole.
If all the experience that we have is that all natural and physical processes, for example, solar radiation, but also rain, wind, etc., are processes of decay that eventually disintegrate all complex systems. Things will fall apart over time. That's the sort of basic law that it's called the second law of thermodynamics. They can vary the existing parameters of a system. For example, iron can rust, but it cannot innovate the system and cannot change one thing into another, particularly something that is more.
Well, maybe not, but it can certainly put the system in a different sort of stress, which therefore it needs to overcome. And that's pretty much what life's about. Someone once said, if evolution is so good, why haven't we evolved not to die? And my answer to that was quite simply, that's what it's doing, just not very well. It's just stopping people from dying too early, so they can actually reproduce. That's on the whole point of evolution, to get life to continue, not to keep one life going.
Complex and more ordered. And yet, we are believed that you can get through these same processes, from molecules to man, as long as we have billions and billions of years of time.
Sure.
But the bottom line is you cannot get order and complexity from disorder, no matter how many billions of years you're waiting. A pile of building materials will not become a house, no matter how long you wait, just by waiting for the rain and the solar radiation to make it happen. It's just not going to happen. In fact, over time, the building materials themselves will crumble and disappear.
Sure. And I mean, you might get onto this later, but an interesting thing that I heard in a talk by Father Rippiger is that he basically said, pertaining to this, he said, you can't give what you don't have, right? So a piece of bacteria can't give the complexity that a human being has. It's impossible. Because, I mean, basically the cause has to be greater than the effect, right? You can't create something that you don't have. I can't make you rich if I don't have $5. It's like that kind of thing. So thank you. But yeah, so continue. Sorry to interrupt.
We also have the proposed mechanism of biological evolution just doesn't work. We call it it's called genetic entropy. A lot of very good work has been done by Dr. Jan Sanford of Cornell. What he did is he measured the accumulation of human mutations at around 100 new mutations per generation. Now, most mutations have a near neutral effect.
Mutation, as I said, over the time. Mutations can have benefits, some do not, some are neutral indeed. Others, however, well, it's more the circumstances surrounding them, not the mutations themselves, that tell us whether they're beneficial or not. For example, if someone has a mutation to have a slightly higher body temperature, they are more likely to survive in a cold environment, and people who happen to naturally have a lower body temperature will survive better in warmer climates. That's just the way it goes. It's more to do with the circumstances than the mutation itself.
On a slightly deleterious, slightly negative. A beneficial mutation, things that will give an improvement, are so rare that they're not even considered, essentially. The bottom line is this: every single mutation in the genetic code over time will either have no effect or degrade functionality. They will degrade. They do not add functionality. It's a bit like if you have a piece of software and you have a software bug, you're not going to get an improvement in your software. It's going to degrade and probably stop working. And what
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think I heard a story of how a bug actually helped improve the system once. I don't know about that, but it's probably something on Reddit that has long since been disproved or just shouted down by people. So, mentioning bugs in systems, you'd be amazed what things happen to coincide with improvement.
um, John Sanford demonstrated through his work is that as humans are actually degrading, we're actually becoming dumber. We're not evolving. And interestingly,
That's more to do with how technology is interfering with our lives because, well, we can now literally just look things up, type in a very simple question, and we get all the answers we need, often the ones we don't need, and sometimes the wrong ones. So we require a bit more work in terms of discernment or even just research, which is very useful for us.
rate of mutation tallies with the biblical chronology. That's one of the reasons why the patriarchs lived for so long, because they were closest to the perfect prototype of Adam.
That's very interesting.
And over time, all these mutations started to accumulate.
And that's more the fact that humans are just terrible beings and therefore just don't like following God's laws. Call it corruption, call it mutation, call it the fall, whatever. It's essentially just us being terrible beings, which is unfortunately very true and something we've yet to grow out of.
And that's why lifespan decreased very significantly. We are getting a slight uplift recently, but that's nothing to do with the genetic situation. It's some improvement of sanitation and medical.
I'll allow for that one because that is very much the case of, well, our healthcare has improved a great deal. As a result, we're able to dispose of bad habits of the past, like marrying young, having children as early as possible, ensuring genetic functions or genetic things are washed out of the system. It's just a happenstance of our medicine rather than anything else. And I'm very aware of some things actually in the past. I think in the Iron Age and Bronze Age, people lived less time than the Stone Age simply because they started eating bread made from millstones, which still contained bits of the quernstone in them, and it just wore their teeth down until they could eat soup, as I often say, just a load of fun. And yeah, that just meant people tended to die off at around 40 rather than into their 60s, which is very much something that could have been done in the Stone Age.
Medical care.
Sure.
But in terms of our genetic patrimony, we are degrading.
Sure. That's very helpful to know. It offers a good explanation to, as you said, why the patriarchs lived for so long. Yeah.
It's also so the bottom line is that genetic entropy has now conclusively
In terms of the patriarchs, there's a lot of debate about whether they are literally the ages of the patriarchs or the numbers or something like that. Some say it's to do with arithmancy, some say to do with their perfect numbers, some it's down to the counting system that would have been used back then, rather sort of the Babylonian base 12 rather than the Britannic base 10, the Roman decimal system, and so forth. So there's a lot of debate about that, to be honest.
Known that the fundamental mechanism of biological evolution, which is the genetic mutation, the idea that through genetic mutation and natural selection, you can get increased functionality, increased order, increased complexity. You can go from a molecule to a man ultimately. Just doesn't work. The mechanism doesn't work. We have irreducible complexity in all biological systems.
Ding, that was that one I mentioned. Going thrust the answer of the heart. My heart was not put together properly when I was born, and therefore I had to have an operation to get it fixed. But the fact they could fiddle around with it made it work. And many, because remember, you're doing it in the wrong direction. Things started off way smaller. We got very simple creatures, and they can quite easily develop into things with hearts and so forth if you do it from that direction rather than from the deconstructive one. You can't reverse engineer things by taking things away. You have to see how you can reduce them bit by bit together rather than do it separately, as they're suggesting.
That is, again, refuting Darwinian evolution according to Darwin's own criteria. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin said, quote, "If anyone would prove the existence of a complex organ that absolutely could not have come from a large number of consecutive changes, then my theory would completely collapse." At the time of Darwin, cells were thought to be very simple blobs of goo. But since then, we've had electron microscopy that has shown that cells are very, very highly complex, what we call nanomachinery, like machines on a very, very small scale. And they all have to be, all the functioning parts have to be present at the same time for the cell to exist and survive. Cells are literally complex cities, which within the interdependent factories and systems, like a headquarter, the nucleus, the transport system, the assembly system, manufacturing, energy production, storage, waste disposal, very intricate systems that all need to be together, otherwise the cell will just die. So this is a classic example of irreducible complexity, a bit like the mousetrap. All the components of the mousetrap need to be there at the same time and have evolved.
Unfortunately, the mousetrap is actually a very bad example, because if you take, say, a classic snap trap, you can have a weighted toothed jaw, you can have a spring that you can just bend round. You can have each of those individually and then bring them together. They do happen to work separately, they just happen to work a lot better together. So the mousetrap is actually a terrible example.
Quote unquote, evolved at the same time in order for the mousetrap to exist and to be working.
Unfortunately, things do evolve together. You can have things come together like that. Some things just happen to merge together. They say that cells develop by having two single-celled items just bump together and merge into each other. Hence, or even bacteria merging into a major cell and thus becoming the nucleus of the cell, or something like that. So there's an awful lot more going on than just a single cell happening to spontaneously develop lots of other things.
This is not how evolution is supposed to work. But if you have examples like a mousetrap, Darwin himself said, then my theory is false. Well, what we found throughout the biological world is massive amounts of these quote unquote mousetraps, these machines that need all of the parts to be there at the same time for them to work. Examples of irreducible complexity. So by Darwin's own criteria, his theory fails. An example I'll do very, very quickly is the cellular flagellum, which is used by bacteria for motion. It's like a
tail.
It's like a tail. You think of it as a tail. It's got all sorts of, it's made up of about 30 proteins with a filament, a hook.
Oh, that one, because I wasn't aware of that one. That's done. I'll have to look that up, but yeah, that's something I wasn't expecting. Giraffe or the dolphin.
And a rotor, so they're very sophisticated on a microscopic scale. The rotor itself can operate at 6,000 to 17,000 revolutions per minute, although the filament, with the filament, it's constrained, so the speed of rotation is down to about 200 to 1,000 revolutions per minute. Still pretty impressive. But it fails to assemble and to therefore be functioning if only one of the 35 genes required to produce the 30 proteins is knocked out. This is an example of irreducible complexity that has been studied by Michael Behe in particular and other scientists that conclusively show that we have these highly sophisticated machines, which Darwin couldn't observe, because the techniques weren't available, but which refute his theory very clearly based on his own criteria.
So just to...
Not sure about that. Some things you can bring together on that sort of scale. They can develop together. Maybe just a tiny little thing that would oscillate and then move the bacterium along. And then that can develop into a circular motion, hence a rotational motion, and thus into the rotary motion that is part of the flagellum, and the longer it gets, the more efficient it is, and so forth. It's gradual things like that. Things just adding on slowly, not just thinking, oh, it's one big thing. No, it's tiny things adding on bit by bit.
In layman's terms, just to make sure I've understood correctly, we're saying that basically this flagellum only works if all of the parts are together. So it's impossible that gradually over time each part came, because it never would have worked.
Correct.
Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
It also cannot account for the origin of specified information, evolution, in biological system. What do we mean by specified information? What we're referring to really is the DNA and the genetic code. What we have found is that genetic code codes for information. It's like a manual, instruction manual for the production of all the materials and the overseeing of all the activities of the cells. It's incredibly complex. It's massive, and it's made up of. So we're talking about DNA, of a very sophisticated chemical and physical language that carries meaning. Think of our language, only orders of magnitude more sophisticated. The words, I'll use simple language. You have genes, you have codons, and so on. But the concept is this. This manual is made up of millions of words. Each word carries a particular instruction or has meanings, has a particular meaning. But the words are so sophisticated, in fact, that if you read the word in one way, you get one instruction. If you read it in the opposite way, you get a different instruction. You have mechanisms that translates those words into a different language, which then can do can be read to deliver other instructions.
True there, but that doesn't disprove evolution. That is again an issue with life beginning. So this has nothing to do with evolution on its own. Evolution is more a system of what happens after life began. This is a system to do with how life began in the first place.
If you read the third word, the third letter of those words, of multiple words, you get a further instruction. What we're seeing is a level of complexity and sophistication which dwarfs our own human language.
Yes.
Imagine, just as an exercise, trying to find a word of 12 letters that gives you one meaning if you read it one way, another meaning if you read it another way, another meaning if you only read the third letters of that word, and another meaning if you translate that letter into a new language. It's just unfathomable. It's impossible. Yet this is what the DNA that we have in each of the cells of the body and that every organism has can do. So where does that come from?
It's beautiful.
Where does that come from?
The mind of God. Yeah.
So any evolution theory cannot count the origin of the specified information, even though they presuppose it in a sense, because without that first replicating organism, there will be no evolution according to them.
Sure.
That is true, and that's something I'll allow. It's very much, but like I said, that is a case for the origin of life, not an issue of evolution itself.
And lastly, I would say that evolution breaches a number of self-evident first philosophical principles, and I think you were referring to some of those earlier. But these are philosophical first principles are principles that do not depend on other principles to exist. They are self-evident. They cannot be proved, but are intuitively true. And our intelligence, our intellect, gives instant assent to them when they're presented to the intellect. For example, the principle of identity. A thing is what it is, or the principle of non-contradiction. A thing cannot be in the same place and with the same respect to another thing at the same time and in the same place. So you have these.
Something can't be, for example, here and there
at the same time
in the same formality. Yeah.
Correct.
That's an interesting one. It doesn't really make a lot of sense how it relates to evolution. I would hazard a guess that one thing that contradicts that idea is quantum mechanics. Apparently, all electrons are literally just one electron, constantly existing throughout history. Something along those lines. It's a weird one, I know.
So if Darwinian evolution has to be true, it has to adhere to first principles. And if it doesn't, because first principles reflect the objective order of things, they reflect the fundamental structure of reality of the created world. So if Darwinian evolution fails to adhere to those first principles, then by definition, it can't be a valid theory. But the problem is we find that Darwinian evolution violates many first principles, which follows that it must be false in whole or in part. And what are those first principles? You mentioned one of them, the principle of sufficient reason. Either the existence of a thing is unaccountable either in itself or in another. You can't give what you don't have. If I don't have $1 million, I can't give you $1 million. If I don't have eyeballs as an organism, I can't give them to the one that is more sophisticated to me, the next one up the line.
Now that one, again, introduces complexity, but that can be traced all the way back to something just having a light-sensitive pigment. It's basically just a means of detecting the world around them. Pretty much, in a way, all things are photosensitive to a degree, and one particular cell can develop to be even more photosensitive and use that to transfer the signal, and that will essentially develop into the evolution of light-sensitive pigment and how the body evolves itself to better make use of that photosensitive pigments, similar to sound-sensitive pigments, vibration, and chemoreceptors, all that sort of thing. So that doesn't really apply in this case. Once those sensors have been picked up, it will eventually develop into something different.
And the primordial soup doesn't have eyeballs.
The primordial soup doesn't have eyeballs, nor does the first amoeba, to be fair, but
the first amoeba might just be more light sensitive in different ways, and like I said, light sensitivity is common even at a quantum level, not to mention a cellular level.
The primordial soup doesn't have lots of stuff that the first amoeba has. So the microorganism.
Sure, okay, yes.
The principle of proportional causality. No effect is greater than the cause. You mentioned that earlier. But here we...
No effect is greater than the cause. I'm not sure about that one, because some things can develop out of control. The classic example is the cascade effect that happens with nuclear reactions. You enclose just a tiny little neutron will trigger a system to go critical, and that will result in all manner of things. You could say technically a bigger event had to cause it to be that unstable, but I think we'll have to leave that in the balance.
Have a systematic violation of this in Darwinian evolution. Life coming from non-life, multi-celled life coming from unicellular life, swimmers from non-swimmers, walkers from non-walkers, flyers from walkers, and so on.
Sure, okay.
And that's just more down to different pressures and so forth. For example, if you're just floating the soup and you find it's easier to mutable certain chemicals with some sort of projection that can undulate, that produces the flagellum, and then so you can mutables your chemicals and such as that. And that develops into fins and so forth. That means you can swim pretty well. Same with walking on land, something that will allow you to move away from predators and stuff like that. It's basically the dynamic of pressures and unfavourable environments. In a favourable environment to start things off, but mainly an unfavourable environment. So that's always the catch-22 of evolution.
It's a constant violation. Principle of resemblance or continuity of nature. Like begets like. All life comes from life. So a dog is going to beget a dog. It's not going to beget a cat or an ape.
That again is more the principle of genetic variation, and also the ship of Theseus. So like you replace the things constantly on the ship. Will it be the same ship, or will it be a different ship entirely? That is the issue. It may look the same, but it's not. Apply the same principle to evolution, things are gradually changing over time. Sooner or later, those tiny changes become something completely different. It won't be what we expect to be a cat, a mouse, or an ape, or something like that, but it's going to be something different nevertheless, and that is the issue.
If I plant my tulips with put some seeds or I plant a flower, I'm going to get the flower that I know I planted, not some other flower.
Yeah, sure. That's the thing. It's actually quite useful, I think. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, if you actually think logically about how things reproduce, this is a helpful way to basically dispel this concept of evolution. Because if you're within a species, right, you have a dog, and you follow the genealogy of the dog, let's say over like 1,000 years. I mean, how on earth are you going to get a cat? Like, do you see what I mean? Because it's just going to stay within the same species. Like, the dog breeds with another dog and gives you a dog, which breeds with another dog and gives you a dog. How on earth do you eventually get a whale? I mean, it's just a completely different.
That again depends on the situation. If you're giving it a wet environment, will it be constantly swimming? If you're giving an arboreal environment, will it be constantly climbing? And it depends on what you're looking for as well. If you're looking for an actual cat, there are cats that act like dogs. And if you're looking for an actual dog that looks like a cat, you've got a fox or something like that. There are creatures like that in the environment. It just depends on how you're looking at it.
It's a different essence. So that's something that's, I mean, very simple.
What they do is they use time. They basically say, well, over billions and billions and billions of years, you are going to get a little change here and there, and it's going to kind of suddenly you're going to fin is going to come out.
I see.
And that's they use time. But the problem is that that fails on all sorts of different dimensions, and we're not going to go into into it too much detail.
Time in a perfect situation, maybe, but since it's definitely not a perfect situation, it will be pressures that matter, not time.
But all these other things I mentioned, just
sure.
And then the last one, I would just say the logical principle. So far, we've talked about real principles, which have to do with the being itself, or the being of a thing. Logical principle, which have to do with how we know about something. And this is the principle of evidence that is refuted. And basically, an explanation or hypothesis must take into account all of the evidence. And a single piece of evidence that is contrary to or cannot be accounted for by the theory renders the theory false in whole or in part. And we have seen lots of them already, and there are many more that we can't really explore in this talk. But evolution is not observed, absence of fossil intermediates, irreducible complexity, and genetic entropy. Those facts taken singly alone suggest, according to the principle of evidence, that the theory is either false, either in its entirety or in part.
And again, we have an issue with the fact there's enough evidence to support it, at least in part, and the things talking about that are really the big barriers are more to do with the scientific origin of life, which is actually beyond the scope of evolution itself, because being down to the chemical level, evolution just doesn't make sense. So there we go. That was the 7 reasons why Darwinian evolution is a myth, and only one thing really stuck out as a major issue with it, and that had nothing to do with Darwinian evolution. It was more to do with the origin of life as itself. Evolution as a process more applies to the moment life is able to reproduce itself. If you don't have that, you don't have evolution. As it is, evolution is a well-established thing and is very much something that keeps going. They mentioned the classic pitfalls of irreducible complexity, statistical improbability, and gaps in the fossil record. But really, when we get right down to it, it's just a similar issue we have with atheists bashing any form of religion. They just don't accept any evidence that happens to be there, and that's just the case across the board. You find that in all manner of people, from theists to atheists to flat earthers to anti-vaxxers. That's just nothing new. We're all human, we all do things poorly. And in this case, it's just not taking something seriously, which actually works pretty well when you understand the principle of it. The only thing that really catches people out is the origin of it all, and that's something he mentioned 3 separate times in separate things that really require something to kickstart it all with something else. That's the thing. Life has an origin that we can't find. We theists believe it's some sort of God. Atheists do not have an answer for that, and until they provide us with something else, I can't see any other reason to believe other than God. You may say it's God the gaps. I don't particularly care what you think at this stage. So that's that, and I'll be interested to see how the comments go. I'll definitely be posting this on Answers for Atheists and see what happens to my popularity then, and see what happens to the channel as well. I might just get lambasted by lots of people for trying to discredit someone who is both an evolutionist but also trying to point out that things seem to be done in a theistic manner. But all that's done, thank you very much for watching. If indeed you still are. If you're interested, subscribe to the channel. I'm doing some more things in my shorts pretty soon. But until then, stay safe, stay humble, and God be with you.